Hello everyone, welcome back to Classical Archaeology. In this video, we're going to discuss ancient Greece during the later classical and Hellenistic periods, from roughly 449 to 146 BCE. We'll talk about Greek culture during this period, some of the major archaeological discoveries that have been made, and how the artifacts that have been found reveal greater truths about Greek society during its so-called Golden Age. Here are some of the topics that will be discussed in this video. One of the greatest examples of later classical Greek architecture, and possibly of all Greek architecture, is the Parthenon of Athens. It is later classical Greek architecture at its finest. The Parthenon and the Temple of Athena and the buildings around it are an amalgamation of earlier Doric and Ionic orders, but they're of the highest form. You can really see by looking at the Parthenon and surrounding buildings that classical Greek architects had really mastered their craft. There's also some new innovations in the Parthenon complex as well, most notably the caryatids, which combine elements of classical Greek architecture and sculpture. The architectural style of the Parthenon, its fusion of Doric and Ionic styles, reflects the values of later classical Athenian society: democracy, a degree of cosmopolitan, and even interest in empire. We'll talk more about Athenian culture later in the video. The Parthenon complex was built on top of the Acropolis of Athens. The Acropolis was a high hill in the center of the city. The Acropolis takes its name from the Greek words akron and polis, meaning highest point in the city. During the Bronze Age, it was probably a Mycenaean citadel, based on documentary sources and archaeological discoveries at the site. There had been temples, including a temple to Athena, the goddess of wisdom and the official patron goddess of Athens, on the Acropolis, but this original temple was probably destroyed by the Persians during their invasion of the city, during the Persian War. After the Persian Wars had come to an end, the Temple of Athena was rebuilt using the wealth of the city of Athens. This construction project took place from roughly 460 to 406 BCE. Here is a rendering of the Acropolis site before the building of the Parthenon. As you can see, there's an old temple to Athena at the center of the complex, and there's roads that connect the Acropolis to the city itself, as well as a wall. The Acropolis may have been used as a fortress into which the old residents of Athens, or the residents of old Athens, could flee during invasions. But it was destroyed during the Persian War because the Achaemenid forces were so powerful they were able to capture not only the city of Athens, but the Acropolis as well. The site was probably occupied in Mycenaean times, as shown by artifacts found nearby, like this statue of a Mycenaean soldier wearing the official boar tusk helmet worn by Mycenaean warriors. Here's some additional images of the Parthenon site and the Acropolis. As you can see, the Acropolis towers over the modern city of Athens, making it a strategically important high point. You can also see the foundations of the buildings that were built at the Acropolis, once again highlighting that the Acropolis was continuously occupied for centuries before the famous Parthenon was constructed. As mentioned before, Persian forces of the Achaemenid Empire destroyed the original temple to Athena on the Acropolis sometime between 480 and 479 BCE. Here is an artist's rendering of what the original temple to Athena may have looked like. As you can see, it's much smaller and plainer than the temple that will be built later on. Here is a floor plan of the original temple to Athena and then the later temple to Athena that was built as part of the Parthenon complex. The original temple is in black. The Parthenon temple is in gray, and you can see it's much larger and grander than the original temple that was destroyed. In the years following the Persian Wars, leaders in Athens wanted to rebuild the temple to Athena and rebuild the Acropolis. They also wanted to add increased fortifications to the city to prevent future destruction in the case of a potential future Persian invasion, or even an invasion from another Greek city-state, possibly Sparta. We'll talk more about the Spartans later. Much of the rebuilding was done under Pericles, the most famous Athenian leader. Pericles oversaw the construction of the Parthenon and other temples at Athens during a period that's often called the Athenian Golden Age, from about the 460s to the 430s BCE. This was a time in which Athens was very wealthy. They defeated their enemies, the Achaemenid Empire. They were seeing increased trade with other Greek city-states and with colonies in other parts of the Mediterranean region. And the Athenians had discovered silver mines, which were bringing a lot of wealth into the city-state. It was also a time of great cultural achievement for the Athenians as well. We see that Athenian theater reaches its height during the early 400s BCE. We also see that the most famous Greek philosophers, including Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, begin their work in the 400s BCE. We'll talk more about Athenian theater and philosophers later in this video. The Parthenon, the temple to Athena, was built from roughly 447 to 432 BCE. It was proposed by the Athenian leader Pericles, shown here at left. The temple was built not only to honor Athena, the goddess of Athens, but to symbolize the power, wealth, and cultural achievement of the city of Athens and its people. As I said before, the Parthenon is a fusion of Doric and Ionic orders, highlighting the cosmopolitanism of the city of Athens. The classical Greeks could be very insular at times, often rejecting non-Greek civilizations, especially after the Persian Wars, in which the Persians had nearly destroyed their civilization. But Athens still showed an element of cosmopolitanism and an openness to other cultures besides their own, partially because of the wealth of the city and because they wanted to trade with other city-states and other cultures. Other city-states, like Sparta, would remain much more insular, even xenophobic, compared to Athens. Here's an architectural diagram of the Parthenon, which showcases the fusion of the Doric and Ionic orders in the temple edifice. You can see that the capitals and the columns, or rather the shafts of the columns, are of the Doric order, but most of the other architectural features are much more of the Ionic order, being more ornate and decorative. Here are some artists' reconstructions of what the Parthenon may have looked like during the 400s BCE. As you can see, the white marble has been painted with a variety of colors. These colors have long since faded away. You can also see the precious metals that are inlaid throughout the building's structure to highlight the wealth of the city of Athens. These images show the intricacy and skill of Greek architects during the classical period. Here are some images of the reconstructive work and restorative work that's being done on the Parthenon. This is a very difficult task. It's a balance of architectural research and inquiry with respecting the importance and the sanctity of the original site to the modern people of Greece. Also, we should keep in mind that the Parthenon has been nearly continuously used for centuries, even after the Greek civilization lost its independence. For example, the Parthenon was used as a Christian church, and when the Ottoman Turks took over Greece, they used the Parthenon as a site to store gunpowder. Some of the gunpowder actually exploded in the 1600s CE and caused a significant amount of damage to the Parthenon. Here's a diagram showing some of the other buildings that were built on the Acropolis of Athens following the Parthenon. You can see the Erechtheion and the Propylaea and the Temple of Athena Nike. We discussed some of these buildings in a previous lecture, but we'll go over some of their architectural features in more detail here. Here is the Erechtheion, which, as you can see, consists primarily of the Doric orders. Notice how simple the capitals of the columns are, and how wide and thick the shafts of the columns are as well. We also see the iconic Doric triglyphs as well, a simple form of decoration to fit with the simplistic, clean style of the Doric order. Here's an image of the Propylaea, which uses more elements of the Ionic order, along with some new innovations like the caryatids, seen here, which combine elements of architecture and sculpture. We'll talk more about the caryatids in a moment. The caryatids were a fusion of Greek sculpture and architectural traditions. The caryatids, statues of women, were more lifelike in detail than those of the archaic and early classical periods that we looked at in a previous video. These statues highlight the increasing skill of Greek sculptors during the later classical period, the Greek Golden Age. Like the Parthenon building, these statues would have originally been painted, although the paint has long since faded away. Scholars believe that these statues, the caryatids, were intended to represent the women of Athens. As they bravely supported their men during the Persian War. Here are some artists' renderings of what the caryatids may have looked like, painted. The colors are very bright. They almost look gaudy to us today, but to the classical Greeks, this painting would have made the statues look even more realistic and lifelike. Here are some reconstructions of the statue of Athena Parthenos. Athena Parthenos would have been the statue inside the Parthenon. It's believed that the original statue of Athena Parthenos was not made of marble, but of a combination of cypress wood, ivory, and gold, as seen on the right. The left image is a Roman copy of the original statue. Roman sculptors often like to copy earlier Greek statues. Here's what the statue of Athena Parthenos would have looked like, placed in the interior of the Parthenon. As mentioned before, the original statue has been lost, and so archaeologists and scholars have had to have guessed what the statue would have looked like. Now we'll discuss ancient Greek theater, a major cultural contribution of the ancient Greek people, alongside things like democracy and philosophy. Theatrical productions probably predated later classical Greece, but they really reached their peak, their zenith, during the later classical period. There are many styles of classical Greek theater, but the two most important by far were comedies and tragedies. Comedies had a happy ending. They were not always laugh out loud funny, although many of them are still hilarious. Tragedies, true to their name, had a sad ending and dealt with much more serious themes. Some of the most important tragic playwrights were Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles. Perhaps the most important comic playwright was Aristophanes. Tragedies tended to depict humans as more honorable and noble than they were in reality. They were meant to inspire and galvanize audiences who were dealing with a variety of problems in their daily lives. Comedies, however, were meant to lampoon contemporary Greek leaders and movements, especially warlike politicians and philosophers, who often seemed to be out of touch with everyday Greek people. Both of these groups became the butt of jokes in comedies. Theater was important in many Greek city-states, but it was especially important in Athens, as seen by the Theater of Dionysus site in Athens, shown on the right-hand side of this slide. Architects of ancient Greek theaters often built theaters into the sides of hills so that the stands could be constructed more easily, and because the hill would provide natural acoustics to amplify the voices of the actors. Later theaters often contained backstage areas where props could be stored and actors could change masks and costumes. These backstage areas also held equipment for special effects, basic special effects, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. Here are some additional images of the Theater of Dionysus in Athens. As you can see, the stands are built into a hill. The stands are built this way so that people in the back rows are able to see the performance. Also, the hill will provide an element of amplification for the actors so that the audience can hear what they're saying. There's also a reconstruction of what the theater may have looked like when it was used in classical times. The stands are full of spectators of the show, and the cast stands on the stage presenting the play. Ancient Greek theater was especially known for its use of masks. Although ancient Greeks would not have called them masks, they would have called them a prosopon, literally meaning face. Masks were important because theatrical production casts were usually very small. There were usually only about 3 lead actors who would play all the major roles by rotating masks and costumes. In ancient Greek theater, men generally played all the leading roles, much like Shakespearean theater centuries later. By the time of the Hellenistic period, though, women began to play minor roles. Ancient Greek plays often included a chorus, a group of people who would sing and recite poetry, and they functioned as a narrator for the plot of the play. Choruses were especially important in tragedies. The masks worn by ancient Greek actors were initially very exaggerated in features, and they would become more lifelike over time. On the left-hand side of the slide are some older masks from both comedies and tragedies. Tragic masks usually have a sad or angry face, while comedic masks tend to have a smiling face. On the right is a much newer mask, believed to be of Zeus, which is much more realistic. Ancient Greek theater used other types of props as well, including costumes, and there were basic special effects that were made in the backstage area, like lowering a cast member from a scaffold, which was called the Deus Ex Machina, God from the machine. A theatrical term that's still in use today. Although the ancient Greeks generally enjoyed theater, actors were not respected and were often viewed as dishonest, being little better than prostitutes, because they sold themselves, pretending to be other people. Now we'll discuss ancient Greek philosophy, including some of the most important ancient Greek philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Our modern word, philosophy, comes from the ancient Greek terms philosophia, meaning lover of wisdom, and the most famous Greek philosophers came from Athens. Archaeologists and historians think that the Athenian economy, which was based around the agora, or marketplace, a place where people could come and talk and share ideas, inspired the creation of philosophy and the emergence of philosophers. Philosophers asked questions about nature, politics, and knowledge. The most famous way they asked questions was the Socratic method, developed by Socrates, in which the philosopher would continually ask questions of the people he was trying to teach. The philosophers wanted certainty through logic, and they taught at schools called academies. These schools were supposed to be free and were dependent upon donations, although some less reputable philosophers, called sophists, often taught their skills to students for a price. But this was looked down upon in classical Greece, and sophists were widely mocked, especially in comedies, by Aristophanes. Initially, many of these philosophers were unpopular. They were mocked by playwrights, and Socrates was forced to commit suicide because he questioned the existence of the gods and was accused of leading the young people of Athens astray. But over time, philosophers became more accepted. The philosophers' approaches to learning and logic would inspire major innovations in the fields of science, mathematics, and medicine, as seen on the right-hand side of this slide, which shows an ancient Greek physician training students. Here is a Renaissance-era image of the death of Socrates. The Athenian citizens voted that Socrates either had to leave the city of Athens, ostracization, or face death. Socrates chose to commit suicide by drinking hemlock rather than leave the city of Athens. Potsherds like these were used to cast ostracism votes. Now we'll briefly talk about some of the principles advocated by ancient Greek philosophers. Socrates' most important student, Plato, shown here in this Renaissance-era image of the Academy of Athens, questioned the efficacy of democracy. He preferred an aristocratic republic instead, in which a small group of wealthy, intelligent, well-educated people, watchers they would be called, would rule over the people. It's unsurprising that Plato would dislike democracies, since it was a democracy that sent his teacher, Socrates, to his death. Plato's student, Aristotle, shown here, also made significant contributions in the fields of politics and art. Aristotle would also serve as a tutor to Alexander the Great, who we'll talk about later in this video. Both Plato and Aristotle believed that the physical world was innately corrupt, and that spiritual forms were naturally better. This idea may have developed from the ancient Greeks' burial rituals, which were far simpler than those of neighboring civilizations. The ancient Greeks in the classical period and earlier wanted bodies to decompose, as compared to the Egyptians who wanted to preserve the bodies of their dead through mummification. Either way, the ideas of the Greek philosophers, like Plato and Aristotle, spread across Greece, but they really remained associated with Athens. Sparta was especially suspicious of many elements of Athenian culture, especially philosophy. The questions that philosophers asked were a threat to the Spartan oligarchic political system. Many other Greeks still did not like philosophers, believing that they questioned the existence of the gods, or that the philosophers pretended to be wise but that they were actually fools, which was why they asked so many questions. Many everyday Greeks also disliked the sophists, philosophers who sold their skills to students, believing that they taught their students not out of a love of learning, but because they wanted to make money. Here are some images of the archaeological excavation of Plato's Academy in Athens. As you can see, it's much simpler than the Renaissance era depictions of the Academy. Now we'll discuss the Peloponnesian War of about 431 to 404 BCE. The Peloponnesian War was fought primarily between Athens and its allies against Sparta and its allies. Athens is here in the peninsula of Thessaly, and then Sparta is further to the south on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. After the Persian War, Athens wanted to transform itself into a navy-based empire. As I mentioned previously, they reveled in the glory of defeating the Persians. They built the Parthenon. They found silver mines that brought a lot of wealth into the city, and they were trading with people across the Aegean and Mediterranean seas. All of this brought a lot of wealth into Athens, and the Athenians wanted to exploit this wealth and become an empire. They formed alliances like the Delian League to make this happen. Sparta wanted nothing to do with Athens after the Persian War. They wanted to return to life as it had been before the Achaemenid invasion. They'd begun to see Athens as a military threat, but as a cultural one as well. The Spartans didn't like Athenian theater. They didn't like Athenian philosophy. They wanted to keep to an older, more traditionalistic system of oligarchy. Athenian philosophers and playwrights just asked too many questions that were seen as a threat to Spartan culture. Now, Greek city-states had gone to war with each other for centuries before the Peloponnesian War, but these wars had been much shorter and were far less destructive. The Peloponnesian conflict was far more destructive, as the Athenians and the Spartans sought to destroy each other's power in a way that previous city-states had not. Most of what we know about the Peloponnesian War was recorded by the historian Thucydides. In the end, the Peloponnesian conflict weakened all of the Greek city-states, setting the stage for the Macedonian invasion and takeover of Greece that happened from 359 to 336 BCE. During the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians and Spartans adopted grand strategies that played to their military strengths, but also to their cultures as well. The Athenians built a strong navy during the Persian Wars, so they were going to rely on a strong navy during the Peloponnesian conflict. They were also going to rely on foreign trade. Pericles, at the center of this slide, was a particular supporter of this naval and trade-based strategy. But unfortunately, Pericles died during the plague of Athens at 429 BCE, at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. Some scholars think that if Pericles had lived longer or survived to the end of the conflict, maybe Athens would have won the war. Sparta, in contrast to Athens, preferred a land-based military strategy, playing to the strength of their hoplites and their training system and their hyper-martial culture. The Spartans preferred to fight on land, and the Athenians preferred to fight on sea, in short. And their allies would follow the lead of their respective city-states. Here is a piece of black figure pottery that portrays a scene from the Peloponnesian War. Here are the fortifications that were built around the city of Athens. These fortifications were part of what provoked the Peloponnesian War. Athens built these fortifications to protect their city from a possible Spartan invasion. The Spartans resented the Athenians' construction of these walls, leading to the beginning of the conflict. At the end of the war, in 406 BCE, the Spartans, led by Lysander, demanded that as conditions of peace, the Athenians tear down the walls around their city, shown at the bottom right of the slide. Although they were both Greek city-states and spoke a similar language and had similar traditions in some ways, the Athenians and the Spartans were also very different from each other as well. Athens was a democracy in which the citizens ruled the city-state. It had a large citizen population as well, although there were significant non-citizen populations of foreigners, chattel slaves, and then women who were not permitted to vote. Athens had a large navy, as mentioned before. It was reliant on foreign trade for its economy, and it was also a very culturally cosmopolitan city-state compared to the other Greek city-states. Sparta, however, was an oligarchy ruled by kings and councils. It had a very small citizen population. The vast majority of the people that lived in and around Sparta were unfree laborers or captives called helots. Helot actually means captive in Greek. And the helots were something between serfs and slaves. They were not bought and sold in the way that the chattel slaves of Athens were, but they were mistreated by the Spartans. The large helot population provided the labor that the Spartans needed so that they could focus their male population on military training. Over time, the Spartans would give the helots more rights, including the rights to serve in the military. But Sparta would still continue to weaken even after winning the Peloponnesian War. And in the end, they would be defeated by the Greek city-state of Thebes and eventually by Macedonia. Life in Sparta, in many ways, was difficult for all of its residents. In general, Sparta was a very harsh, authoritarian society. It was an oligarchy, ruled by kings and councils. The Spartans practiced eugenics. They would leave infants with health problems out to die. This was done in other ancient Mediterranean societies, but it was especially important to the Spartans, as they wanted to make sure that they only raised people who could become healthy soldiers. In the case of men, or in the case of women who could give birth to more healthy children. Boys would be taken from their families about the age of 7 to undergo the very brutal agoge military training, which would go on until they were about 20. In this training, the boys would be taught to fight in wrestling and in other forms of martial arts. They'd also be trained how to use hoplite armor and weapons. And if they survived 10 years of military service, they would become citizens around the age of 30. During their agoge training, young Spartan males were taught to steal and even kill the helots. They would only be punished if they were caught. In general, Spartan society was less interested in art, theater, and philosophy, preferring to focus all of its efforts on military training. The origin of certain modern words like Spartan and laconic actually come from ancient Sparta. Spartan, of course, means very rough, simple accommodations. You might say that a room with no furniture is Spartan. Laconic, meaning using few words, is also said to come from ancient Sparta because Spartans did not like to give long, ornate speeches and have big, deep conversations in the way that the Athenians did. Some scholars think that women had more rights in ancient Sparta, being allowed to participate in sports, for example. But women were encouraged to participate in sports so they could give birth to physically strong children. So the Spartans' decision to give their women additional rights was motivated by their militaristic culture, rather than a desire for gender egalitarianism. Here are some images of Athenian and Spartan soldiers at about the time of the Peloponnesian War. As you can see, the Spartan soldiers are not wearing very much armor. This is because Sparta was a poorer city-state than Athens, who preferred to provide their soldiers with better armor and equipment. Nonetheless, though, Spartan soldiers were much better trained, being lifelong soldiers, whereas the average Athenian soldier was a citizen soldier who had a civilian career and only took up arms to fight for the Athenian city-state temporarily. In the end, Sparta won the Peloponnesian War, and the Greek city-states on the whole were greatly weakened by the Peloponnesian War and subsequent civil wars. These civil wars made the Greek city-states vulnerable to takeover by Macedonia. There is some debate over whether the Macedonians should be considered Greek. For the purpose of this class, we'll consider the Macedonians to be Greek because of the significant cultural similarities and overlaps between Macedonia and the Greek city-states. The Macedonian takeover of Greece was initiated by Philip II, king of Macedonia, or the city of Macedon. Philip II lived from about 382 to 336 BCE. Philip strengthened the Macedonian army through increased military training, and he also gave his soldiers new weapons, like the long sarissa, which was a type of pike. Philip himself was a very hardened warrior. He'd lost an eye in combat, as seen on the image on the right-hand side of the slide. He may have also had a lame leg as well, possibly an injury that he sustained in combat. Philip took advantage of the extremely violent and divisive civil wars in Greece to the south of Macedonia, and he eventually defeated all the major city-states. Philip wanted to take control of the other Greek city-states because he wanted to invade the Achaemenid Persian Empire, but he was assassinated in 336 BCE. His son, Alexander the Great, would fulfill Philip's dream of invading the Persian Empire. Here's a map showing Philip's conquest of the Greek city-states. It took the Macedonians longer to conquer Sparta than it did to conquer the other city-states, as you can see. But eventually Sparta would become a Macedonian subject as well. Here is an image of the facade of the tomb of Philip of Macedon. As you can see, it's built in the Doric style, very clear Doric columns and triglyphs. You can also see there is paintings on the exterior of the tomb. Philip II's tomb and the grave goods he was interred with are more expansive and extensive than the burial arrangements made for earlier Greek leaders. Philip was buried with expensive armor, gold caskets, crowns, and many other things, more like the Mycenaeans rather than the archaic or classical Greeks. Still, nothing compared to say, an ancient Egyptian tomb. Philip's tomb reflects the loss of egalitarianism in Greek society after the Macedonian takeover, setting the stage for the more aristocratic Hellenistic period. We'll talk more about the tombs of the Hellenistic period later in this video. Philip's skeletal remains indicate that he suffered from multiple painful wounds during his life. The loss of an eye and a badly broken leg, which may have left him lame even. And we also know that he was assassinated and did not die of natural causes. Here's an image of Philip's skeletal remains, which show some of the health problems he had in life as a result of injuries. His skeletal remains also confirm documentary sources which state that he was assassinated and did not die of old age. After Philip's assassination, Alexander the Great took over the Macedonian throne. Alexander the Great lived from 356 to 323 BCE. During his reign, he strengthened Macedonians' rule over the other Greek city-states. He put down revolts in Thebes and Athens, and then he led a united Greek empire against the Achaemenid Empire. In battle, Alexander the Great consistently faced much larger enemy forces, but he never lost a battle. He was a brilliant tactician, and he adopted many military technologies that were well suited to fighting the Persian armed forces. Alexander initially wanted revenge on the Achaemenid Empire because they had invaded Macedonia and the rest of the Greek city-states. But after actually going to war with the Persians, Alexander showed a surprising amount of restraint and respect towards his enemies, taking the Greeks in a more pluralistic direction as a civilization. During the Archaic and early Classical period, the Greeks had learned a lot from other civilizations. But during the later Classical period, the Greeks developed a more positive opinion of themselves and began to see other non-Greek civilizations as not as good as they were. That changed, though, during the reign of Alexander the Great, who showed quite a bit of respect for non-Greek peoples, similar to the much older Archaic and early Classical periods. Here's a map of Alexander the Great's campaigns through the Persian Empire. As you can see, he moves eastward through Asia Minor, liberates Egypt, which we talked about in a previous video, and then moves his way into Mesopotamia and eastward towards India. He won every major battle in which he fought. And he turned around at the Indus River primarily because his soldiers were becoming homesick and they wanted to return to their families. Interestingly, many of their families did not even live in Macedonia or Greece, but in other parts of the former Persian Empire, as many of the Greek soldiers had taken Persian and Babylonian and Egyptian wives. Here are some images of Alexander the Great's infantry soldiers armed with sarissa spears. The sarissa was much more like a pike than a traditional spear, and Alexander's soldiers used smaller shields than the hoplites of previous centuries. But the sarissa pikes were the ideal weapon to fight the Persian army by the 300s BCE, because by the 300s, the Persians had moved away from an infantry-based armed forces more towards one based around cavalry, namely horsemen and chariots. So pikes and long spears were ideal for defeating soldiers on horses. The Macedonian soldiers still fought in the older Greek phalanx, which provided excellent protection for foot soldiers against faster-moving cavalry. Here are some images of modern war reenactors showcasing ancient Macedonian arms and equipment. As you can see, the sarissa pike is much longer than the spears used by the hoplites of previous centuries. Alexander's soldiers also used smaller shields than the hoplons used by the hoplites. Their helmets provide less protection as well, but they gain increased vision and maneuverability by using less protective helmets and smaller shields. The phalanx of the Macedonians and the sarissa pikes were well suited for combating the Persian immortals and also chariots and horsemen, and eventually war elephants. Alexander's forces faced war elephants the further east they went in the Achaemenid Empire, especially as they got close to India. Alexander's armies also may have started to use war elephants themselves, in addition to their phalanxes. Here is an image of the Battle of Issus, November 5th, 333 BCE, a major victory for Alexander the Great, in which he faced Persian King Darius III. Alexander is seen on the left-hand side of the slide riding on a horse, and you can see Darius on the other side of the slide in a chariot. The Mycenaean Greeks had used chariots, but Greeks from the Archaic period into the Hellenistic period preferred to ride on horseback rather than use chariots in combat. Here are some images in a battle map of Gaugamela, fought in 331 BCE. This was the major battle that led to the collapse of the Achaemenid Empire. Darius III was killed by his own troops after the battle. Darius and his armies actually outnumbered Alexander and his forces by nearly 3-1, but the discipline of Alexander's phalanxes and his brutal counterattack on the Persians allowed him to win the day and secure a major victory that would lead to the collapse of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And as I mentioned, Darius III, after his failure to defeat the Macedonian Greeks, was killed by his own troops. Alexander was very disappointed to hear that Darius had been betrayed by his own men. He developed a sort of respect for his adversary. He made sure that Darius received a proper funeral befitting a Persian king, and then he had the men who killed Darius executed for their betrayal. Tragically, Alexander the Great died prematurely in his 30s at Babylon in 323 BCE. Most scholars think that Alexander the Great died of malaria, but others think that he may have been poisoned, and it may have been an assassination, just like his father, Philip. We don't know for sure. I think death by disease is more plausible. After his death, Alexander's body was taken from Babylon to multiple parts of his empire. It was traditionally believed that he was buried at Alexandria, Egypt, as shown in this image, although in recent years historians and archaeologists debate Alexander's final resting place. We have not found his skeletal remains, and we don't know for sure if we've even found his tomb. There's multiple sites that are purported to be the tomb of Alexander the Great. After his death, Alexander's generals would have wanted to claim his body and have it buried in their territory. That way they could legitimize their rule, which is why there's multiple sites that are purported to be the burial place of Alexander the Great. Here is one possible sarcophagus that may have held Alexander the Great's body at one point or another. As I mentioned before, Alexander's generals seem to have fought over his body, and we don't know for sure where it was finally buried. After Alexander the Great's death, his generals divided his empire into 4 portions. reflecting the more aristocratic and stratified nature of Hellenistic society. The Greeks of the Hellenistic period began building much larger and more elaborate tombs than they had in previous years. These tombs are much more elaborate than those built of the classical Greeks, who wanted to have small tombs to reflect the comparatively egalitarian nature of their society. The Hellenistic Greeks liked to carve their tombs out of rock formations, especially cliffs. This slide shows the tomb of Zechariah near Jerusalem. This tomb was probably not made by a Greek person, but it shows the Hellenistic style, tombs cut into the rock using elements of Greek architecture like these Ionic columns. We also see an Egyptian style pyramid on the top of the tomb. So there's an Achaemenid and Egyptian influence in this tomb. The Achaemenid influence is because the Achaemenids like to build their tombs into rock outcroppings. But we can see the Greek influence as well. Ultimately, these tombs show not only social stratification, but a degree of pluralism and cultural syncretism in Hellenistic Greek society. Here are some more rock-hewn Hellenistic tombs. These are from Turkey, or Asia Minor, as it would have been called at the time of the Hellenistic Greeks. As you can see, there's a variety of Doric and Ionic architecture on display in these tombs. And they're carved into the rocks, something that was popular amongst the Achaemenids. But the Egyptians, during the New Kingdom, began to carve their tombs into rock cliffs, the Valley of the Kings being the most notable example, which we discussed in a previous video. So once again, these tombs show cultural syncretism, in addition to showing social stratification, because they're so much grander and they would have been so much more expensive to construct than the tombs made by the classical Greeks. Here is the facade of the Tomb of Judgment in Lefkandi, Greece. As you can see, it uses elements of the Doric order, but it also has elements of the Ionic order as well in these reliefs at the top of the edifice. You can also see that this tomb would have been painted as well. Here are some more images of rock-hewn Hellenistic tombs being built across the Macedonian Greek Empire. The Hellenistic Greeks were more pluralistic than the classical Greeks, and they combined elements of non-Greek cultures into their sculpture work, and non-Greek people combined elements of Greek art and sculpture into their artistic traditions. Here are some sculptures from the Indo-Greek tradition, which combines elements of Indian art and culture with elements of Greek art and culture. Here we see a statue of the Buddha wearing a Greek-style chiton or chiton tunic. We also see a man with Asiatic facial features, but with Greek-style hair and Greek-style facial hair. These images of Indo-Greek sculptures highlight the pluralism that the Hellenistic Greeks spread across their empire as far as places like India. As mentioned in a previous video, the Greeks combined elements of Egyptian art, culture, and spirituality into their artistic works as well. On the right-hand side of this slide is a statue of Serapis, the god of the dead. Serapis was an amalgam of ancient Egyptian and ancient Greek beliefs about the dead, combining elements of the Egyptian god Osiris and the Egyptian god Anubis with the Greek god of death in the underworld, Hades. Hellenistic Greek sculptors also made other innovations on their own. Hellenistic Greek sculptures on the whole became much more lifelike. Hellenistic Greek sculptors still portrayed deities and heroes, but they also started to portray non-Greeks and everyday Greek people more frequently, which is very interesting considering Hellenistic Greek culture was more stratified and focused on the aristocracy. Sculptors of the Hellenistic period could portray the ideal human form, but they also began to portray their subjects a bit more realistically, showing age, physical features, and even things like disabilities. On the left-hand side of the slide, we see a boxer with a broken nose. On the right, we see an elderly, toothless market woman. These Hellenistic sculptures were so good and so realistic that later Roman artists copied many of them. Here is an image known as the Dying Gaul or the Dying Celt. This is actually a Roman copy of the Hellenistic Greek original. As I mentioned before, Greek sculptors, because the period was more pluralistic, they began to show more non-Greek people in their sculptures, like this Celtic warrior. Keep in mind, though, that this is a Roman copy of the original Hellenistic sculpture. As mentioned before, Hellenistic sculptures were highly detailed. We can see the facial expression of pain on the Celtic soldier as he grimaces and looks down at the wound below his chest. He also clasps his knee, suggesting he was wounded in that part of his body as well. We can also see the necklace that he is wearing is of a Celtic style as well, showing that the Hellenistic Greek sculptors were paying attention to non-Greek cultures, right down to small details, like the necklace. Here is another famous Hellenistic Greek sculpture. It is of Laocoon and his sons. Laocoon was the priest of the mythical city of Troy, as described by Homer. We don't know if he was a genuine historical figure, but he would have been inspiring to Hellenistic Greek sculptors. In the Homeric myth of the destruction of Troy, as seen in the Iliad, Laocoon the priest prophesies that the Greeks will destroy the city of Troy, but then he and his sons are consumed by sea snakes sent by Poseidon, the god of the sea. You can see the priest and his sons struggling against the snakes, which are biting them and constricting them. You can see their muscles rippling against the force of the snakes, and you can see the look of fear and pain on their faces. The details on this work of sculpture are amazing, and they would inspire later Roman sculptors to make copies. Perhaps the most famous statue of a woman from the Hellenistic period is the Venus de Milo, or Aphrodite de Milo. In this statue, the sculptors would have wanted to represent the ideal female form, since they were portraying a goddess, especially the goddess of love, which Aphrodite was. Unfortunately, the sculpture's been damaged. Her arms have been broken off. On the right-hand side of the slide are some archaeologists' recreations of what the Venus de Milo may have looked like with complete arms. Some think she may have been writing with her arms that are missing. Others think she may have been doing a more feminine task, like weaving. We just don't know for sure. Some people think that the Venus de Milo sculpture may have been clandestinely representing disability as well. Some think that the woman depicted in the statue may have had scoliosis based on how her back has been carved, but this is unconfirmed and rather controversial. It is interesting to think about, though, that a statue representing the ideal female form may also show signs of a physical disability as well. These are two things we often don't think of as fitting together. During the Hellenistic period, Greek architects began to experiment further with the Corinthian order of architecture. The Corinthian order actually predates the Hellenistic period, but it really came into its own during the Hellenistic years. It was developed in the 400s BCE in Corinth, hence its name. It's much more ornate than the older Doric and Ionic orders, and some scholars think that the Corinthian order may have evolved from the Ionic order. But its capitals are much more ornate than the Ionic order, and they're decorated on all sides, designed to be seen from all angles. The Corinthian order became more popular during the Hellenistic period as Greek architects increased their skill and attention to detail. Other civilizations that the Greeks came in contact with during the Hellenistic period, especially the Roman and Indian civilizations, greatly admired the Corinthian order, as we'll see in a moment. Here's an image of the temple of Olympian Zeus in Athens. This temple was built over the course of several hundred years, but it was finished by the Romans in the Corinthian style, after the Romans had taken over Greece. Here are some images of Indo-Corinthian columns, which combine artistic elements from the Greek Corinthian order and from Indian art and culture and spirituality. Here you can see elephants on top of the capital of a Corinthian column. You can also see an image of the Buddha in the center of the capital. Once again, highlighting the cultural syncretism that took place in Alexander the Great's empire, and then in the empires that existed after Alexander's death. The Greek people lost their independence during the final years of the Hellenistic period. Inspired by the wealth of the Greeks and the richness of their culture, the Roman Republic invaded and gradually took control over Greece, including Macedonia, from about 200 to 146 BCE. The big decisive battle that led to the end of Greek independence was fought at Corinth in 146 BCE, shown on the left side of this slide. Although the Greeks had lost their independence, their culture would survive and continue to thrive under Roman rule. As admirers of Greek culture, the Romans spread Greece's art, architecture, and language across their expanding territorial holdings, and they made their own modifications and adaptations of Greek culture. In the end, the later classical and Hellenistic periods in ancient Greek history were a time of significant cultural innovation. The ancient Greek civilization experienced a golden age in the years following the Persian War and preceding the Peloponnesian War. There were numerous Greek cultural developments during this period, especially those related to architecture, theater, and philosophy. The Peloponnesian conflict and other civil wars weakened the Greek city-states, leading them to be taken over by the Macedonians. Under Alexander the Great, the Greeks conquered the Achaemenid Empire, and their culture became more pluralistic, although it also became less egalitarian. Greek and Near Eastern artists practiced cultural syncretism, mixing elements of their cultures into their works, as seen by the rock-hewn tombs and then Indo-Greek sculpture and architecture, all of which we discussed in this video. At the same time, Hellenistic Greek artists continued to innovate on their own, particularly in the fields of architecture and sculpture. Their sculptures became more realistic and lifelike and detailed. and architects began to experiment more with the Corinthian order, which was far more ornate than the older Doric and Ionic orders. Alexander the Great's empire would collapse and divide after his death, and the Greek city-states would be taken over by the Romans. But Greece's culture would live on and even expand during Roman rule.